The golden silence of a late afternoon in Chicago was shattered by sharp shouts, loud and full of authority, slicing straight through the calm. It happened on a quiet residential street, where most folks were just finishing their day, some watching TV, others tidying up their porches. Suddenly, that peace was gone as two officers from the Chicago Police Department rushed at Marcus, a black man walking home from work, and threw him hard onto the cold sidewalk. They didn't pause or explain. There was no hesitation in their actions, and absolutely no compassion. The physical pain was clear from the start. His shoulders scraped rough against the concrete, his knees knocked into the curb. But the real sting was something deeper. It was the humiliation, being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood, while neighbors peeked through blinds. Some stared with concern, others just curious, but none spoke up. As one officer pinned Marcus's arms behind his back, locking on the handcuffs so tightly his wrists burned, Marcus tried to hold on to some shred of dignity. The wet fall leaves crushed beneath him released a raw, earthy scent. Blood trickled from his lip, giving him a bitter, metallic taste. Above it all, a wave of injustice settled deep inside, planting a memory he knew would haunt him long after the bruises faded. The officer's violence wasn't just a random burst of aggression. It came from something deeper, a prejudice woven into their actions and words. Officer Mitchell, who couldn't have been more than 26, held an air of arrogance that came from feeling untouchable in that uniform. To him, Marcus wasn't just another resident walking home. He was instantly a suspect, someone who didn't belong in this part of Chicago, someone to be handled roughly and publicly. The way Mitchell glanced down at Marcus said it all, a look that was cold, certain, and unafraid of any consequences. His partner, Officer Reynolds, was older and gave off a different energy, more chilling in its own way. As she pressed Marcus's shoulder harder against the pavement, she wore a slight but unmistakable smirk, a look of cruel superiority, as if she genuinely believed this humiliation was not just justified, but necessary. Around them, the city's hum faded as tension hung heavy on the block. Inside, Marcus felt the anger simmering. He wanted to shout, to fight back, but years of experience as a youth counselor and community organizer taught him that any protest would be twisted, made to fit the story they already wanted to tell. So he forced himself to stay calm, keeping his voice even and his words measured. Right then, it was the only choice he had left. All of this started in the most ordinary way. Marcus had planned nothing more than a quiet walk through his South Side neighborhood after being out of town for several months, working long hours, and missing home. For once, he wanted to just enjoy a little peace. No meetings, no calls, just the simple comfort of familiar streets. He slipped into an old sweatshirt and jeans, the kind of clothes that never drew a second glance, and took his time stepping down the block. It was a cool Chicago evening, and he let himself enjoy the feel of the breeze and the hum of life around him. But that feeling of normalcy was shattered in a moment. In an instant, the whole street turned into the stage for something Marcus knew wasn't really about him, but about so much more. The officer's suspicion wasn't based on anything he had done. He had barely gone 2 blocks when their squad car slowed, the two of them watching him with eyes that never softened. That itch for authority, that hunger to control, turned a relaxing evening into a nightmare he never could have seen coming. 1 second, he was just another neighbor. The next, he was treated like a threat for no reason other than how he looked and where he was. The questioning began before Marcus could even process what was happening. Officer Reynolds spoke first, her voice sharp and laced with mockery as she fired off questions. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, glancing Marcus up and down like he was something to be dealt with, not a neighbor she might see at the corner store. "Who are you really meeting? Walking around here, what's your business?" Each question came with an edge, full of suspicion and the clear message that Marcus did not belong. Mitchell hovered close by, arms crossed, staring at Marcus as if waiting for him to trip up with his words. Marcus tried to keep his voice steady. He pointed down the block, telling them, "I live right over there, that red brick house on the corner. I just got back after a few months away for work." He kept his tone calm, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they would listen. But as he spoke, Reynolds just smirked and shook her head, her disbelief almost theatrical, like she had already decided he was lying before he even opened his mouth. Mitchell shared a quick, knowing glance with her, both of them making it clear they thought this story was just another excuse. Even from their windows and doorways, neighbors could tell the whole thing was wrong. It wasn't lost on anyone that Marcus was being treated like a stranger, like a threat, in his own neighborhood. As the tension mounted, Marcus realized he had to stand up for himself despite how shaky he felt inside. His voice was steady, though, as he asked a simple question that anyone in his place should be allowed to ask. "Can I see your badges?" It was his right, and he knew it. For a split second, the street seemed to hold its breath. That one request was enough to change the whole vibe between them. Mitchell's face tightened with annoyance, and Reynolds' eyes flashed like he had dared to challenge an unspoken rule. Instead of showing their badges, the officers drew closer, almost chest to chest with Marcus. Now they were inside his space, speaking louder, tossing sharp questions. It was clear they wanted him to back down, to feel small. Reynolds leaned in, her words cold. "Why do you care, huh? We're the police." Her tone left no room for discussion, just threat and authority. Mitchell squared his shoulders and rested a hand near his holster, like he wanted to remind Marcus of what was at stake if he pushed too far. Their refusal to identify themselves said a lot, maybe even more than their words. It was like they believed rules didn't apply to them, that nobody had the right to question their behavior. Around them, the block grew quieter, everyone feeling the weight in the air, wondering if this was the moment things would take a turn for the worse. Without any warning, Reynolds shoved Marcus hard, making it clear this whole thing was not about proper police procedure, but about showing power. The move was rough, enough to nearly knock Marcus off balance. He caught himself on the curb, his wrists aching where the handcuffs dug in. The message was obvious. Any sign of standing up for himself would be crushed right away. Neighbors watching from behind half-open windows saw the whole thing, each person silently weighing the risk of stepping outside against the guilt of staying hidden. Marcus, for all his years working with youth and having faced tense moments before, was no stranger to confrontation. He had training and experience that might have helped in almost any other tough situation. But he knew this was something different. With police officers in uniform and all authority on their side, the consequences of even a slight physical response would be completely out of proportion. If he so much as shifted his weight wrong, they could claim he was resisting. So he kept still, swallowing his pride with every breath. Every muscle in his body screamed for some kind of release, but he forced himself to focus on staying calm. It hurt, knowing he had the skill and confidence to defend himself. But in that moment, restraint was the only thing keeping him safe. Things quickly went from bad to worse. With a rough twist, Reynolds swept Marcus's legs out from under him, and Mitchell used his weight to press Marcus face down against the chilly sidewalk. In seconds, cold metal cuffs snapped shut on his wrists. All of this happened right in full view of his neighbors and the blinking of security cameras set up years ago to deter crime, not record moments like this. The feeling of humiliation settled deep in Marcus's chest. He could see Mrs. Thompson peeking from her window and a teenager on his bike slowing down to stare, their faces frozen in a mix of shock and fear. Every part of the scene made Marcus's anger and frustration even sharper. It wasn't just that he was being treated like a criminal. It was that it was happening on his own street, in front of people who knew him and never would have suspected he belonged in handcuffs. The officers, meanwhile, seemed to get bolder with each move. Reynolds stepped back with her arms folded, lips curled into a proud smirk. Mitchell took a stride around Marcus like he was showing off a trophy. There was no hint they saw Marcus as a real person. Everything about how they acted said they believed they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. Lying on the rough concrete, Marcus refused to let fear or shame silence him. Taking a breath to find his voice, he spoke loud enough for everyone to hear, his tone cutting through the heavy quiet that had settled over the street. "Every bit of this is on camera," he said, nodding slightly toward the row of houses with visible security systems and pointing out the chest-mounted body cams the officers wore. "You might think nobody's watching, but these folks see everything. And so will anyone else who looks at the footage. That simple statement had an effect. For the first time all evening, Reynolds' smirk faded just a little, and Mitchell's grip eased as he paused to look over his shoulder toward the homes lining the block. There was something in Marcus's tone, calm, steady, and used to giving orders, that made them stop and reconsider. It was the voice of a man who had led groups, negotiated through difficult situations, and carried the weight of responsibility long before this moment. He was not begging or panicking. He spoke with the steady confidence of someone who demanded respect by sheer presence. Seeing that shift, even for a second, was a small victory. Both officers, for the first time, looked unsure. It was enough for neighbors to start whispering, some courage returning to their faces. Marcus kept his voice steady as he said, "You need to call your supervisor. Right now." There was no anger in how he said it, just a solid sort of confidence that made it clear he was not making a request. That single sentence put a new kind of pressure on Reynolds and Mitchell. The two officers, now aware of just how visible their actions were, started fidgeting as they traded uneasy glances. The roles had shifted. No longer did Marcus seem like the one under their control. In that moment, he was the one steering things. Reynolds hesitated, her jaw clenched. She clearly didn't like the idea of handing off any authority, but she saw how shaky this all looked. Neighbors were still watching, some of them pulling out their phones to record. Mitchell bit his lip, then finally reached for the radio clipped to his vest. His hand did not seem nearly as steady as before. He pressed the button, his voice coming out a little unsteady for the first time since they'd arrived. "Dispatch, this is Officer Mitchell. We need Sergeant Lewis at Westfield Avenue. Possible situation with escalation, needs supervision," he said. In that instant, the whole street seemed to wait, feeling that something bigger was about to unfold. The response from the radio crackled through the quiet, more urgent than Marcus or the officers expected. "Mitchell, hold your position and do nothing until I get there. Do not engage further," came the order, and everyone could hear the strain in Sergeant Lewis's voice. There was something about how he said Marcus's name, like he immediately understood the weight of the situation. Mitchell and Reynolds froze, their bravado evaporating in an instant. Suddenly, they looked less like figures of authority and more like rookies who realized they had stepped far out of line. Marcus watched them carefully, seeing how quickly fear took over where arrogance had stood only moments before. The officers no longer postured or tried to intimidate. Instead, they avoided eye contact, focused on the ground, and seemed painfully aware of how their actions might look on camera. Across the street, the neighbors talked quietly in small groups, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The pause stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. Marcus remained calm, his breaths even. He knew the wheels had started turning in his favor now. Reynolds glanced at Mitchell, as if silently asking how things had gone so wrong, but no one said a word while they waited for their boss to show up. Within several minutes, the street filled with flashing lights and the sound of engines, as more police cruisers and an official city vehicle from the Oversight Bureau turned onto Westfield Avenue. The neighbors stepped back but kept their eyes glued to the scene, their phones raised and recording every detail. You could feel the tension in the air, the kind that makes your shoulders tighten and your mind race, wondering what would happen next. It was no longer just a police stop. It was becoming the center of attention for the whole block, maybe even the whole community. Chief Donald Harris of the New York Police Department, a tall man with a reputation for getting involved when it mattered most, climbed out of the bureau car without pausing to look at Reynolds or Mitchell. He walked straight past the line of younger officers, barely giving them a glance, and stopped in front of Marcus, who was now sitting upright against the curb, hands still cuffed but his composure never slipping. Chief Harris's face showed honest concern, not just for Marcus, but for what this moment could mean for the department and for the neighborhood. He knew bad news traveled fast in a city like New York. Around them, the crowd got bigger, pressing against the makeshift barrier police had put up. Every second was being captured from every angle, by security cameras, by news vans starting to show up, and by dozens of cell phones. It felt like the whole city was watching. Chief Harris wasted no time. With a firm, clear voice that carried over the murmurs of the crowd, he told Reynolds and Mitchell to uncuff Marcus right away. There was no room for argument in his tone. Both officers hurried to follow the order, their hands a little shaky as they fumbled with the keys. The cuffs came off, leaving Marcus free at last, but the deep sting of everything that had happened was still there, impossible to erase with a simple gesture. The neighbors and reporters caught every second. This moment was about more than one man. It was about a system that needed fixing. Chief Harris didn't stop with the release. He turned on Reynolds and Mitchell, scolding them in full view of everyone for how they had handled things. His words were sharp and direct. This was unprofessional, unacceptable, and not what the department stood for. The air was heavy with their embarrassment and the crowd's expectation. Still, Marcus stood without anger, but his eyes showed just how much the event had cost him. He met the chief's gaze straight on, his voice steady as he said apologies would not be enough. There had to be real answers, real change, if respect and trust were ever going to mean anything again. Word of what happened on Westfield Avenue spread fast. What started as a neighborhood event quickly became the top headline across the city and then the entire country. News outlets picked up cell phone videos, and soon people everywhere were talking about Marcus, the police, and Chief Harris. It did not stop at the local level either. Officials from City Hall, along with leaders from federal watchdog agencies, called for immediate updates and demanded accountability. By dinner time, politicians and activists were weighing in, and the mayor herself held a press conference calling for a full investigation. The spotlight on the New York Police Department grew fierce. It was no longer only about Officer Reynolds or Officer Mitchell and the mistakes made that afternoon. Journalists and community leaders started asking bigger questions about the department's training, the rules they followed, and the way officers interacted with people every day. People on the street, whether they live in the area or not, suddenly felt connected to Marcus's ordeal. Chants for reform replaced whispers, and frustration made way for action as protesters gathered not just at the police station, but outside City Hall. Behind closed doors, top brass faced hard truths about a system with cracks too wide to ignore, and change felt more urgent than ever. The day after the incident, another wave of reporters and cameras filled the steps outside the main police station in Manhattan. Under the full glare of the media, Officer Mitchell and Officer Reynolds stood silently as their badges and guns were taken away. They did not argue or make a scene. They just stared into the distance, knowing their actions had been broadcast to the entire nation. The department made it clear this was an official suspension, effective immediately. The chief explained to reporters that the discipline was not just about these two individuals, but about sending a message that certain behaviors would never be tolerated again. Still, despite this very public punishment, there was restlessness in the community. Marcus's story had become a symbol for others who had gone through similar trouble, but never got this kind of attention. People wanted to know how many times events like these had happened behind closed doors, when there were no phones out, no chief on the scene, and no one to hear the other side. Families gathered at town halls and community centers all across New York City, wrestling with feelings that mixed hope for real change with frustration over how slow that change always seemed to come. The story was not over, not for Marcus, and not for anyone else. Marcus, though still shaken by everything that happened, refused to step back or be silent. He started speaking out right away, at community centers, on the local news, and eventually on national talk shows. Using his position and voice, Marcus demanded that the New York Police Department do more than just suspend a couple of officers. He pushed for open records, calling for every complaint and disciplinary file to be made available to the public. He talked about how anti-racist training for every officer could make a difference, not just for people like him, but for the city as a whole. He said it was not enough to apologize after the fact. There needed to be teams of independent people watching and reporting on how police worked. Marcus's courage and focus started something bigger. His neighbors, who once just watched from their windows, showed up at meetings and rallies. Young people and older folks alike began sharing their own stories and hopes for a fair system. Soon, what happened on Westfield Avenue was not just a single heartbreaking event anymore. It became the spark that brought New Yorkers together, demanding laws and policies that would shape the way justice was carried out for years to come. A real sense of momentum began moving through the city. As Marcus and others kept the pressure on, the city's oversight bureau, called the New York City Civilian Review Board, launched a full investigation into the police department. Over several weeks, teams of independent inspectors went through years of hiring records, training GUID, liens, and internal memos. When they finally released their findings, they laid everything out plainly. The selection process for new officers had too many gaps, and the training did not prepare anyone to handle complex, real-life situations with the kind of care and respect that was needed. The report stressed just how far the department had fallen behind when it came to upholding basic human rights. With the community paying close attention and Marcus's voice growing louder, city officials responded. They announced the start of a new, independent watchdog council made up of regular citizens, legal experts, and advocates. This group would not only review complaints, but also set standards and monitor everything from the first day of police academy classes to how officers interacted with people on the street. For the first time, many in New York felt there might be real accountability. People wanted to see proof that these changes would stick, so neighborhood groups began organizing monthly meetings to keep an eye on whether promises turned into action. Even with all the reforms starting and the Oversight Council holding its first meetings, Marcus carried a heaviness that was hard to shake. Life at home on Westfield Avenue felt different. Sometimes the house where he once felt safest now seemed like a reminder of everything that happened. The shouts, the cuffs, the flash of cameras. He found himself double-checking the front door at night, not for fear of break-ins, but because trust in the system that was supposed to protect him felt cracked. Walking through his own neighborhood, Marcus wondered how many others felt just like him, seeing ordinary places through the lens of pain and caution. Through these tough days, his family and friends stuck by his side. His wife, Ellen, made sure he had space to talk, or just to be quiet if that is what he needed. His brother, Charlie, visited often, sometimes bringing takeout from Marcus's favorite spot in Harlem just to lift his spirits. Kids in the neighborhood waved and called out whenever they saw him. Everyone seemed to understand that, no matter a person's status or job, rights could be shaken up in a single moment. For Marcus, healing was slow, but he knew he was not alone in his struggle. As the months passed, Marcus's story kept showing up not just in New York but across the United States. His experience with the police became something people talked about on college campuses, at city council meetings, and even on talk radio shows from Chicago to Los Angeles. Experts brought up his name every time debates about racism and abuse of power came up. Community organizers held up what happened to him as a clear sign that reforms could not wait. Even politicians who had once tried to avoid tough conversations now pointed to Marcus's case to explain why changes were vital and why the usual way of doing things would never be enough. What really moved the conversation forward, though, was how Marcus refused to hide what he went through. By speaking plainly and showing his pain, he helped other people find their voices. Soon, more and more folks from all walks of life felt comfortable stepping up and sharing their own run-ins with unfair treatment. Some of their stories had gone ignored for years, but now, with new attention and support, those stories were finally heard. The push for real equality and respect did not just grow, it started to feel unstoppable. Marcus had lit a fire that kept on burning. Over the next year, the New York Police Department rolled out a series of changes that people had been demanding, and everyone could see these were not just for show. Every new officer had to go through a careful screening that focused on respect for diversity and understanding real-life situations. Veteran cops had to take regular training focused on fair treatment and community interaction. These sessions were held not just in classrooms, but out in the neighborhoods, so that officers could hear directly from residents about their concerns. This process was watched closely by community monitors, groups set up by the city and led by people like Marcus, who had become a familiar face at panel discussions and oversight meetings. Marcus made it a point to keep showing up, never letting officials forget why the reforms were put in place. He joined review boards, asked tough questions, and never let anyone dodge responsibility. He was not alone, either. Many others who had once stayed quiet now helped guide the changes. Slowly, trust began to grow between police and the people they were meant to protect. Open meetings became a regular thing, and both sides started to recognize each other not as opponents, but as neighbors. Marcus's painful experience, while leaving scars, had helped spark a new sense of fairness that touched everyone around him. As the city slowly adjusted to these new policies and conversations, Marcus came to realize something bigger than his own need for healing. He saw clearly, maybe for the first time, that what he was fighting for went way beyond just his personal story or even trying to get an apology for what happened. He decided he could not walk away, not when so many people across New York and all over the country still face the same fears and the same unfair treatment, often without even a chance to speak up. Marcus made a promise to himself. He would keep working, joining boards and listening sessions, making sure the fight for justice included everyone, especially those without power or connections. More and more, his experience became a kind of guide for young people, teachers, and city leaders who wanted to understand how to make things better. It turned into something folks could look at whenever they felt that little changes did not matter. His name and his story remained a steady reminder that nobody is above the law and that facing ugly truths with honesty can lead to real change. Even though the pain stayed, hope began to take root, pointing toward a fairer future that everyone could believe in.